Thank you, Georgia, for that wonderful, good word, and for doing half my job for me. I can just wrap up the sermon now, right? Well, it's a beautiful thing to be part of not only a beautiful, robust congregation like St. Paul's, but for you to be part of a larger network of congregations called a synod, which is part of an even larger network, which is part of the Church Universal, right? And we heard a little bit of what this church and what this synod does for the larger global mission of the church in the world. And you're part of that. So pat yourselves on the back, and more importantly, give that praise up to God, because He's at work in and through this congregation and this synod. And it's very fitting, I think. Some of the things Georgia shared with us fits quite a bit into my prepared remarks this morning, which I'm paring down a little bit for the sake of time. We're part of this vine, right? This imagery in the gospel this morning where Jesus says, I am the vine and you are the branches. Abide in me as I abide in you, and you will bear good fruit. Well, we heard a little bit about the good fruit, some of the good fruit that we are collectively bearing. I like this image of the vineyard, and whenever Jesus uses sort of agricultural metaphors to talk about the Christian faith, it resonates with me, I think, because my father's a gardener, and I've often spent time in the garden with him, helping cultivate plants and watching them grow. And especially the vineyard, because, well, my dad doesn't grow grapes, but we buy the grapes and we crush them and we make the wine, and that's a fun process all the way through, right? And one of the things my father plants, that was the first thing I thought of when I read this gospel text, was watermelons. Bear with me, it'll make sense in a second. My father grows all different varieties of melons, you know, from the cantaloupes and to the big watermelons and all different kinds, bright orange melons that are sweeter than candy. And it's always a joy for the family that, you know, we pluck one and it's like waiting on bated breath to find out if it's ripe or if we pick it too early. Or you can never quite tell with a watermelon. I don't care what anyone tells you, there are sort of tricks of the trade. They slap on them like bongos, and if they make a certain sound, you know they're ready to pick. That might work for some people, but it's never quite sure, never quite certain if this watermelon is going to be too early. And you don't want to let it sit there too late, because if it absorbs too much water, it will burst. And that's no good. So it's better to have an unripe watermelon that you can eat as opposed to one that bursts and you can't eat, I guess. But when you get that sweet spot, when it's perfectly ripe, you know, there's few things more pleasant in the summertime than a cold, delicious piece of fruit that's full of hydration and nutrition, right? Well, the thing about a watermelon, the reason why it's tricky is because unlike a tomato, which you can pick from the vine and put on your countertop and it'll ripen on its own for a few days, right? A watermelon doesn't do that. A watermelon stops ripening the second you sever that root, because it ripens by drawing water out of the ground, and that water releases the sugars. And if you pick it too early, it can't get any more water, it can't continue to ripen. So it's the same with us, right? It's the same with this metaphor that Jesus is using. He says that if you do not abide in me, you are a branch that begins to wither. You dry up, and you're not good for anything except for casting into the fire. Well, that's not a very nice thing to say, Jesus. I don't like that. You know, there's enough hellfire and brimstone out in the world and in other churches that you really don't need to hear it here. And I really don't think that's where Jesus is going with this metaphor. He's simply describing the state of affairs, the spiritual state of affairs that we find ourselves in. If we're not rooted in the source of our strength and the source of our power, the source of our spirit, that which enlivens us, if we're not connected to that, we do begin to wither. And we don't produce the fruit of good works that we were created for. We cease to be and do the things that humans are supposed to do as God created us when we are disconnected from that source. And what Jesus is telling us is He is a sure and trustworthy tap root into that source of our spiritual thriving, the source of our spiritual power, that which gives us the strength to overcome adversity and the strength to do all manner of wonderful things on the face of this earth. So what does a right Christian look like? How do you know when a Christian is ready for plucking? What are the qualities of a right human being? Right? I think the book of 1 John that we read from this morning describes it really, really well. I'm going to read for a second from here. God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. Love has been perfected among us in this, that we may have boldness on the day of judgment, because as He is, so are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out all fear. We love because He first loved us. Those who say, I love God, and hate their brother or sister are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they can see cannot love God whom they can't see. I know it's one of these cliche things when it all boils down to all you need is love and you're singing with the Beatles. But it really comes down to this. The love of God given to us is that nutrition, it is that water, it is that what we receive from the vine that makes us whole, full, round human beings, right Christians, so to speak, able to bless the world with our sweet goodness. And whenever we think about another member of the branch, right, we think, there's a branch that's drying out. They're withering up. They're destined for that fire pile, right? As soon as we have that feeling in our hearts toward our brother or our sister in Christ, then maybe that's when we need to check our connection, right? Because we're probably the ones drying up and withering a little bit. So maybe you feel like a dry, withering branch. Maybe you do not feel thoroughly nourished by the Spirit. Maybe you don't feel right. The good news is you know exactly where to go to reconnect to the source of your strength. You reconnect to the source of your strength at the font, where you remember your baptism, at the table, where you quite literally drink of the vine of Jesus and eat the bread of life. You reconnect here in the hearing of God's holy word. You reconnect at the coffee hour over the 8th sacrament of coffee. You reconnect when you do the work of the Lord with the people of God. This is a great vineyard here. This is a very healthy plant. This is a place bursting with right Christians. And you're one of them. At least you can be. And you will be. If you remain rooted in the vine, if you remain abiding in God's love will abide in you. That's a promise. So continue to grow, continue to let your roots spread as this plant that we are growing together, that we are part of, grows up into God's kingdom, into God's glorious ecosystem, this spiritual ecosystem which He has planted for the purpose of blessing the ground it is planted in. So thanks be to God.
Amen.